The autumn leaves crunched beneath 17-year-old Sarah Chen's combat boots as she walked through the gates of Riverside High School for the first time. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a plain black jacket over jeans that had seen better days. To anyone watching, she looked like just another transfer student trying to blend in during her senior year. What they didn't know was that Sarah had just moved from a classified military installation where her father, General Marcus Chen, had been stationed for the past 3 years. What they couldn't see was the discipline in her posture, the way her eyes automatically scanned for exits and potential threats, or how her seemingly casual walk was actually a practiced military stride toned down for civilian life. Sarah had attended 12 different schools in her 17 years, thanks to her father's military career. She had learned long ago that being the new kid was always challenging, but being the daughter of a high-ranking military officer came with its own unique set of problems. Some kids were intimidated, others were resentful, and a few were downright hostile toward anything connected to the military. As she pushed open the heavy doors to the main building, Sarah noticed the typical high school hierarchy immediately. The popular kids clustered near the trophy cases, their designer clothes and confident laughter marking their territory. The athletes lounged by the gymnasium entrance, their Letterman jackets like armor against the world. The academic achievers hurried past with their arms full of books, and the rebels leaned against lockers with studied indifference. Sarah had been all of these things at different schools. She had been the popular girl at Fort Bragg, the academic star at West Point's Preparatory Academy, and the quiet outsider at the international school in Germany. She had learned to adapt, to read people quickly, and to survive in any environment. But today, she just wanted to be invisible. Her first period was American history with Mrs. Rodriguez, a stern-looking woman with kind eyes who introduced Sarah to the class with minimal fanfare. As Sarah scanned the room for an empty seat, she caught the whispered comments that always followed the new kid. "Great, another military brat," someone muttered from the back row. "Look at those boots." "Trying too hard to be tough," came another voice. Sarah had heard it all before. She took the empty seat in the third row and pulled out her notebook, focusing on Mrs. Rodriguez's lecture about the Revolutionary War. The irony wasn't lost on her that she probably knew more about military history than most of the teachers in this school, having grown up on bases and heard first-hand accounts from veterans and active duty personnel. During the break between classes, Sarah was organizing her locker when she felt someone bump into her shoulder hard enough to make her drop her books. She turned to see a tall blonde girl with perfectly applied makeup and an expression of barely concealed disgust. "Oops, sorry about that," the girl said with fake sweetness. "I'm Madison Walsh. I basically run the social scene around here." Her tone suggested that Sarah should be grateful for the introduction. "No problem," Sarah replied calmly, bending to pick up her scattered books. She had dealt with alpha personalities before, and Madison Walsh was textbook mean girl material. "So, where did you transfer from?" Madison asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't really interested in the answer. "My family moves around a lot," Sarah answered vaguely, straightening up with her books in hand. Madison's eyes narrowed slightly. "Military brat, then. I can always tell. There's something different about you people. Always acting like you're better than everyone else because you've lived in other countries or whatever." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't think I'm better than anyone." "Right," Madison said with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Well, just so you know how things work around here, this isn't some army base where everyone has to follow orders. We have our own way of doing things." Before Sarah could respond, Madison turned and walked away, her expensive heels clicking on the linoleum floor. Sarah watched her go, noting the way other students automatically moved out of Madison's path. She recognized the behavior. Madison ruled through intimidation and social pressure, maintaining her position by making others feel small. The rest of the morning passed without incident, but Sarah could feel eyes on her wherever she went. In the cafeteria, she sat alone at a table near the windows, eating the sandwich she had packed from home. The food service reminded her too much of base mess halls, and she preferred the quiet moment to observe the social dynamics around her. Madison held court at a large table in the center of the room, surrounded by what appeared to be her inner circle. There was Jessica, a redhead with designer clothes who seemed to hang on Madison's every word. Trevor, the quarterback with an ego bigger than his throwing arm. Brittany, who looked like she spent more on her nails than most people spent on groceries. And several others who formed Madison's loyal following. Sarah was used to military communities where rank and respect were clearly defined by service and sacrifice. This teenage hierarchy based on wealth, looks, and social manipulation felt foreign and somehow hollow. But she also knew that every community had its own rules, and she would need to navigate them carefully if she wanted to survive her senior year. As she was finishing her lunch, Madison appeared at her table with her entourage in tow. "So, Sarah, right?" Madison said, sliding into the seat across from her uninvited. "I'd been thinking about our conversation earlier." Sarah looked up from her sandwich, her expression neutral. "Okay. I realized I might have come across as unwelcoming, and that's not who I am," Madison continued, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "I like to take new students under my wing, show them how things work around here." "That's nice of you," Sarah replied carefully. "The thing is," Madison said, leaning forward slightly, "integration is really important. You can't just come into an established community and expect to fit in without making an effort." Sarah recognized the manipulation tactic immediately. Madison was setting up a scenario where any resistance from Sarah would be framed as antisocial behavior. "What kind of effort are you talking about?" Sarah asked. Madison's smile became predatory. "Well, for starters, that whole military tough girl thing you've got going on? It's not really working here. Maybe try dressing more like a normal teenager. And those boots have got to go." Jessica giggled on cue, and Trevor smirked from his position behind Madison's chair. "These are just my regular clothes," Sarah said simply. "Right, and that's the problem," Madison replied. "Look, I'm trying to help you here. But if you're going to be stubborn about fitting in, then maybe you'd be more comfortable eating lunch in the library or something." The threat was clear, and Sarah could see that other students were watching the interaction with interest. In military terms, Madison was testing her defenses, probing for weaknesses. The smart tactical response would be to appear to comply while gathering intelligence about her opponent. "I appreciate the advice," Sarah said, keeping her voice level. "Good," Madison said, standing up. "I'm having a party this weekend. Big house, parents out of town, all the important people will be there. Consider it your chance to make a real first impression." She dropped a piece of paper with an address on the table and walked away, her followers trailing behind her like satellites orbiting a planet. Sarah looked down at the address, recognizing the street name as one of the wealthy neighborhoods on the other side of town. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket, not because she planned to attend, but because intelligence gathering was always important. The afternoon brought chemistry class, where Sarah found herself partnered with a quiet boy named David who seemed grateful to have someone competent to work with. He was clearly one of the academic achievers, with thick glasses and a nervous manner that suggested he was familiar with being targeted by bullies. "Thanks for actually knowing what you're doing," David whispered as they successfully completed their lab experiment while other groups struggled. "Usually I get stuck with people who think chemistry is just mixing random stuff together." "I like science," Sarah replied simply. What she didn't mention was that she had taken advanced chemistry courses at the military academy and had access to educational resources that most civilian schools couldn't match. "Madison was talking to you at lunch," David observed quietly. "Just be careful with her. She's got a way of making life difficult for people who don't fall in line." Sarah nodded, appreciating the warning even though she had already assessed the situation herself. As the final bell rang, Sarah made her way to her locker to collect her things. The hallways were filled with the usual after-school chaos of students rushing to catch buses, head to after-school activities, or meet up with friends. Sarah was looking forward to the quiet of her family's temporary housing on the nearby military installation where they were staying while her father completed his transition to his new assignment. She was closing her locker when she felt someone grab her backpack and yank it hard enough to pull her backward. She turned to see Trevor and two of his football teammates grinning at her with the kind of aggressive stupidity that she recognized from dealing with young recruits who thought being tough meant picking on people smaller than them. "Hey there, Army girl," Trevor said, still holding her backpack. "Heard you had lunch with Madison today." "She sat at my table," Sarah corrected calmly. "Right, and she was being nice to you," Trevor continued. "But, then, I heard from some people that you weren't very grateful for her hospitality." Sarah could see the setup coming. Trevor was Madison's enforcer, the muscle that backed up her social manipulation with physical intimidation. "I was perfectly polite," Sarah said. "Were you?" Trevor asked, taking a step closer. "Because I heard you were pretty rude. And nobody disrespects Madison Walsh in this school." The hallway was clearing out, and Sarah noticed that the few students remaining were either looking away or pulling out phones to record whatever was about to happen. She recognized the pattern. This was a performance designed to establish dominance and send a message to other potential challengers. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Sarah said evenly. "The only misunderstanding," Trevor replied, "is you thinking you can come into our school and act like you own the place just because your daddy's in the army or whatever." One of his teammates laughed. "Maybe she thinks she's some kind of soldier." Sarah felt the familiar calm that came over her in potentially dangerous situations. Her father had trained her in self-defense since she was 12, not just the basic techniques that most teenagers learned, but real military combat training. She could have put all three boys on the ground in under 30 seconds. But she also knew that violence would only escalate the situation and create more problems than it solved. She was trying to blend in, not start a war. "I'm not looking for any trouble," she said. "Too bad," Trevor replied, "because trouble found you." He shoved her backward against the lockers, hard enough to make a loud clang that echoed through the nearly empty hallway. Sarah felt the anger rise in her chest, but she kept it controlled. She had been in actual dangerous situations with real consequences. A teenage bully was not going to break her composure. "That's enough," came a voice from down the hallway. Everyone turned to see Mr. Patterson, the vice principal, walking toward them with the kind of expression that suggested detentions were about to be handed out. Trevor immediately released Sarah's backpack and stepped back, his expression shifting to innocent confusion. "Just talking, Mr. P," he said with a grin. Mr. Patterson looked between Trevor and Sarah, clearly trying to assess what he had interrupted. "Miss Chen, are you all right?" he asked. Sarah straightened her jacket and shouldered her backpack. "Everything's fine." She could have reported the incident, but she knew from experience that would only make things worse. The adult authorities would give Trevor a slap on the wrist, and Madison's crew would escalate their campaign against her. "Good," Mr. Patterson said, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "Mr. Bradley, don't you have football practice?" "Yes, sir," Trevor replied, already backing away. "We were just heading out." As the boys left, Mr. Patterson turned back to Sarah. "If you're having any problems adjusting to the school, my door is always open." "Thank you," Sarah replied. "I appreciate that." But, as she walked out of the school and toward the bus stop, Sarah knew that her problems were just beginning. Madison had marked her as a target, and, in the complex social ecosystem of high school, that meant she was now fair game for anyone looking to score points with the popular crowd. The bus ride to the base was quiet, giving Sarah time to think. She had faced down armed insurgents in training exercises, survived natural disasters during overseas postings, and adapted to more cultures and languages than most adults ever experienced. But, somehow, navigating the petty cruelties of teenage social warfare felt more exhausting than any of that. As the bus passed through the security checkpoint at the base entrance, Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Here, at least, everything made sense. Rank was earned through service and sacrifice. Respect was given based on competence and character. And bullies were quickly identified and dealt with through proper military discipline. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Hope you're planning to come to my party Saturday. It would be such a shame if you missed it." Sarah stared at the message, recognizing the implicit threat.
Madison was escalating, moving from social pressure to direct intimidation.
In military terms, this was Madison declaring open warfare. What Madison didn't know was that Sarah had been preparing for war her entire life. And, unlike the social games that Madison was used to winning, Sarah played by rules that the popular girl couldn't even imagine. As the bus pulled up to her stop, Sarah made a decision. She wouldn't run from this fight, and she wouldn't hide behind her father's rank or her family's military connections. But she also wouldn't play by Madison's rules. She would use everything her military upbringing had taught her about strategy, intelligence gathering, and tactical thinking. And, when the time was right, Madison Walsh would discover that she had picked a fight with the wrong new girl. The war for Riverside High School was about to begin, and Sarah Chen had no intention of losing. The next morning, Sarah arrived at school 15 minutes early, using the extra time to conduct what her father would call reconnaissance. She positioned herself near the main entrance with a clear view of the parking lot and student drop-off area, observing the social dynamics with the analytical eye of someone trained in military intelligence. Madison arrived in a silver BMW convertible, music blasting loud enough to announce her presence to the entire school. She was accompanied by Jessica and Brittany, both of whom seemed to exist solely to make Madison look better by comparison. Trevor pulled up in his lifted pickup truck, its oversized tires and aggressive exhaust system compensating for something Sarah suspected he lacked in other areas. What interested Sarah most was the way other students reacted to Madison's arrival. Some looked away quickly, others moved to give her group plenty of space, and a few brave souls offered tentative waves that may or may not be acknowledged. It was a perfect example of rule through fear rather than respect. Sarah had seen similar dynamics on military bases when incompetent officers tried to maintain authority through intimidation rather than earning it through leadership. Those officers rarely lasted long in the military, but high school operated by different rules. During first period, Sarah noticed that word of yesterday's confrontation had spread through the school's gossip network with the efficiency of a well-coordinated intelligence operation. Students whispered and pointed when they thought she wasn't looking, and she caught fragments of conversations that ranged from sympathetic to gleefully anticipatory.
"Did you hear Madison's already planning something for the new girl? Trevor said she was totally rude to Madison at lunch yesterday."
"I heard she's some kind of military kid. Those people are always weird."
Sarah let the comments wash over her without reaction.
She had learned long ago that reputation was a weapon that could be used for or against you, depending on how you managed it. Right now, Madison was controlling the narrative, painting Sarah as the aggressor and herself as the victim of disrespect. In military strategy, this was called information warfare, and Sarah knew that winning required more than just defensive measures. During lunch, Sarah deliberately chose a different table, one that gave her a clear view of Madison's usual spot while appearing to avoid confrontation. She was halfway through her sandwich when David from chemistry class approached hesitantly. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, glancing nervously toward Madison's table.
"Sure," Sarah replied, gesturing to the empty chair across from her.
David sat down with his own lunch, a carefully packed meal that looked like it had been prepared by someone who understood nutrition and budgeting. Sarah recognized the signs of a family that had to be careful with money, something she had observed in many military families as well.
"So," David said quietly, "I heard you had some trouble yesterday." "News travels fast around here," Sarah observed.
"This place is like a small town," David explained.
"Everyone knows everyone else's business.
And Madison makes sure that anything involving her gets maximum coverage."
Sarah nodded, taking a bite of her sandwich. "Tell me about her. How long has she been running things?"
David looked surprised by the direct question.
"Since middle school, basically.
Her dad owns half the businesses in town, and her mom is president of the school board."
"Madison's untouchable." "Everyone has weaknesses," Sarah said simply.
"Maybe," David replied doubtfully. "But she's got too much power and protection. The teachers love her because she gets good grades and her family donates money to the school. The students either fear her or want to be her.
And the administration won't do anything because her parents basically fund their jobs." Sarah absorbed this information, filing it away for future reference. Madison's power structure was more complex than simple popularity. It was based on economic influence, family connections, and systemic protection. Breaking that would require more than just standing up to a bully. What about her friends? Sarah asked. Trevor and the others? David glanced around nervously before answering.
Trevor's been her boyfriend since freshman year, but it's more like a business partnership. His family owns the biggest car dealership in town.
Jessica's dad is the police chief.
Brittany's mom runs the biggest real estate company.
They're all connected.
Sarah felt a familiar chill run down her spine.
This wasn't just high school drama.
This was a network of power and influence that extended far beyond the school walls. Madison wasn't just a teenage queen bee, she was part of a system that protected itself through mutual benefit and shared interests.
And anyone who challenges them? Sarah asked.
Gets crushed, David said simply. There was a girl last year, Emma Rodriguez.
She tried to report Trevor for cheating on a test.
Within a week, her dad's landscaping business lost 3 major contracts, her mom got written up at work for performance issues, and Emma ended up transferring to another school.
Sarah felt her jaw tighten.
This was beyond typical teenage bullying. This was abuse of power on a level that would make her father's military sense of justice burn with anger.
How do you know all this? She asked.
David looked embarrassed.
My mom works at the courthouse. She sees things, hears things.
And she makes sure I understand how things really work around here so I don't get any ideas about being a hero. Smart advice, Sarah said, though she wasn't sure she agreed with it.
Look, David continued, I like you.
You seem decent, and God knows this place could use more decent people. But picking a fight with Madison Walsh is like declaring war on the entire power structure of this town.
And you're just one person. Sarah nodded thoughtfully.
David was right about the scope of the problem, but he was wrong about one crucial detail.
She wasn't just one person.
She was the daughter of a United States Army general, raised in a family that had sworn oaths to protect and defend against enemies both foreign and domestic.
And what Madison Walsh was running looked suspiciously like domestic corruption to Sarah's trained eye.
After lunch, Sarah made a detour to the school library, where she used the computers to do some research.
A few searches revealed information that confirmed David's story and added disturbing new details. Madison's father, Robert Walsh, owned Walsh Industries, a conglomerate that included construction, real estate development, and government contracting.
Her mother, Patricia Walsh, had been school board president for 6 years and had a reputation for aggressive advocacy for fiscal responsibility that usually translated to cutting programs that helped lower-income students. Trevor's family dealership held exclusive contracts with the city government for all municipal vehicle purchases. Jessica's father had been police chief for 8 years and had a track record of being remarkably lenient with certain families when their children got into trouble. The pattern was clear: these families had created a closed loop of influence that protected their interests and eliminated threats through economic pressure rather than legal action. It was the kind of corruption that federal investigators would take very seriously if they knew about it. Sarah was still processing this information when she became aware of someone standing behind her. She turned to see Madison herself, flanked by Jessica and Brittany, all three wearing expressions of cold amusement.
Doing a little research, Sarah?
Madison asked, her voice carrying just loud enough for other students in the library to hear.
Just catching up on local history, Sarah replied calmly, closing the browser window.
How interesting, Madison said, stepping closer. You know, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I realized something important. Sarah remained silent, waiting for Madison to reveal her hand. You're not like the other transfer students we get here, Madison continued. Most of them are smart enough to understand the social structure and work within it. But you seem to think you can just ignore how things work.
I'm still learning, Sarah said diplomatically. Madison's smile turned predatory. Well, let me help speed up your education. See, this town has been run by certain families for generations. My great-grandfather started the first major business here. Trevor's family has been selling cars to everyone in town for 40 years. Jessica's grandfather was police chief before her dad. We have roots here that go back decades. That's nice, Sarah said.
The point, Madison said, her voice hardening slightly, is that people like you come and go.
Military families never stay anywhere long enough to matter. You're just passing through, but this is our home. Our legacy. Our responsibility to maintain order.
Sarah felt a surge of anger at the casual dismissal of military families, but she kept her expression neutral.
I understand. Do you? Madison asked. Because I'm starting to think you might be one of those people who needs to learn things the hard way.
She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that only Sarah could hear.
My party on Saturday isn't really an invitation. It's a test.
Show up, apologize for your attitude, and maybe we can find a place for you in our system. Don't show up, or show up with the wrong attitude, and I'll make sure your family's stay in our town becomes very uncomfortable.
The threat was direct and unmistakable.
Madison was using her family's influence to threaten Sarah's father's career and her family's well-being. In military terms, she had just committed an act of war against a federal officer's family.
I'll keep that in mind, Sarah said evenly.
Madison straightened up, her public smile returning.
Good. I'm glad we understand each other. As Madison and her entourage left the library, Sarah felt the last of her restraint evaporate.
She had been willing to endure personal attacks and social manipulation for the sake of maintaining peace. But threatening her family crossed a line that Sarah would not allow to be crossed. She pulled out her phone and sent a text to her father, "Need to talk when you get home."
Important.
The rest of the day passed in a blur of classes and careful observation. Sarah noticed that word of her library conversation with Madison had spread even faster than yesterday's confrontation. Students looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and morbid curiosity, as if they were watching someone walking toward the edge of a cliff. After school, Sarah skipped the bus and walked the 3 miles back to the base, using the exercise time to think through her options. She could report Madison's threats to the school administration, but David had made it clear that the system was designed to protect the Walsh family. She could tell her father and let military justice handle the situation, but that would only confirm Madison's assessment that military families used their power to solve problems. Or she could handle it herself, using the skills and knowledge that 17 years of military life had given her. By the time she reached the base housing where her family was temporarily staying, Sarah had made her decision. She would attend Madison's party, but not as the submissive new girl that Madison expected. She would go as the daughter of General Marcus Chen, trained in strategy and tactics, with a clear mission objective. Her father was already home when she walked through the front door, still wearing his dress uniform from what had probably been a day full of briefings and administrative meetings. General Marcus Chen was an imposing man even out of uniform, with the kind of presence that commanded respect in any room he entered. "Sarah," he said, looking up from the paperwork spread across the dining room table.
"How was your second day at the new school?"
"Complicated," Sarah replied, setting down her backpack and taking a seat across from him.
Her father's expression became more focused.
In their family, complicated was code for a situation that required careful analysis and strategic thinking. "Tell me about it," he said, setting aside his pen and giving her his full attention. Sarah spent the next hour giving her father a complete briefing on the situation at Riverside High School, including Madison's network of family influence, the pattern of economic retaliation against challengers, and the direct threat that had been made against their family. General Chen listened without interruption, his expression growing progressively more serious as Sarah outlined the scope of the problem. "This is more than a high school bullying situation," he said when she finished. "Yes, sir," Sarah agreed. "This appears to be a systematic abuse of power that extends into potential federal contracting irregularities and civil rights violations."
Her father nodded slowly. "You've done good reconnaissance, Sarah. The question now is what action we should take."
"I'd like to handle it myself," Sarah said.
"At least initially." General Chen raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Madison Walsh thinks she's dealing with a typical military family that will either submit to local authority or use federal power to bulldoze through problems, Sarah said. She doesn't understand that we prefer to use precision rather than overwhelming force. What are you proposing?
Sarah leaned forward, her voice taking on the crisp tone she had learned from years of listening to military briefings.
Intelligence gathering, sir.
I attend the party, document whatever illegal activity occurs, and build a case that can be presented to the appropriate authorities through proper channels. That sounds like you're planning to put yourself in potential danger, her father observed. With respect, sir, I've been in more dangerous situations during our overseas postings.
And I'll have backup. What kind of backup? Sarah smiled for the first time all day.
You didn't raise a daughter who goes into battle without a plan, Dad. General Chen studied his daughter's face for a long moment, seeing the determination and intelligence that had been shaped by 17 years of military life.
All right, he said finally.
But this is a reconnaissance mission only.
No direct engagement unless you're defending yourself.
And you maintain communication throughout the operation.
Understood, sir.
And, Sarah, her father added, his voice softening slightly, remember that sometimes the best strategy is knowing when not to fight.
I know, Dad.
But sometimes you have to fight to protect the people who can't protect themselves. General Chen smiled with pride at his daughter's response.
That's why we serve, isn't it?
As Sarah headed upstairs to plan her mission, she felt the familiar calm that came with having a clear objective and the skills to achieve it. Madison Walsh had made the mistake of threatening a military family without understanding what that really meant. On Saturday night, Madison would learn that some new girls come with training that goes far beyond anything she could imagine. And the quiet teenager she had tried to intimidate was about to reveal herself as something far more formidable than a typical high school student. The war for Riverside High School was about to enter a new phase, and Sarah Chen was ready to show Madison Walsh what real strategy looked like.
Friday morning brought new intelligence that changed Sarah's tactical assessment of the upcoming party.
During chemistry class, David slipped her a note that contained information he had overheard from his mother's work at the courthouse. Madison's party isn't just a party, the note read.
Trevor's been bragging about having special plans for you.
Something about teaching military families their place. My mom heard Jessica's dad telling someone that any disturbance calls from that address tomorrow night will be handled with appropriate consideration for community relationships.
Be careful.
Sarah read the note twice before carefully folding it and putting it away. The situation was more complex than she had initially assessed. Madison wasn't just planning social humiliation, she was orchestrating something that had the potential for serious legal consequences, with the local police apparently prepared to look the other way.
This changed everything.
During lunch, Sarah excused herself to the bathroom and used her phone to call her father's direct line. General Chen, came his crisp voice.
Dad, it's Sarah. I need to update my mission parameters.
She quickly briefed him on the new intelligence, watching the bathroom door to make sure she wasn't overheard. That changes things significantly, her father agreed. This appears to be a coordinated effort involving potential police corruption.
Are you sure you want to proceed?
More than ever, Sarah replied. But I'm going to need backup that can respond if things go wrong.
What do you have in mind?
Sarah outlined her revised plan, drawing on tactical knowledge she had absorbed from years of listening to military strategy discussions. That's actually quite clever, her father said after she finished explaining. I'll make the necessary arrangements.
But, Sarah, if this goes sideways, you extract immediately. No heroics.
Understood, sir. The rest of Friday passed with increased tension. Madison made a point of publicly reminding Sarah about the party during passing periods, each interaction designed to build anticipation among the student body. By the end of the day, it felt like the entire school was aware that something significant was going to happen on Saturday night. Trevor and his friends made sure Sarah overheard fragments of conversation about teaching the Army brat a lesson and showing her how real Americans handle disrespect. The military references were clearly intended to provoke Sarah into losing her composure, but they had the opposite effect. Every insult only strengthened her resolve to see this mission through to completion. Saturday evening, Sarah prepared with the same methodical attention to detail that she had learned from watching her father prepare for important operations. She chose her clothing carefully: dark jeans that allowed for easy movement, a fitted black t-shirt that wouldn't restrict her arms, and her combat boots, which Madison had criticized but which provided excellent support and traction. More importantly, she prepared her mission equipment: a small digital recorder that could capture audio evidence, her phone, fully charged and configured with her father's emergency contact information, a small LED flashlight, and a tiny camera device that her father had provided from his office supplies, designed to look like an ordinary pen but capable of recording high-definition video. At 7 p.m., Sarah hugged her parents goodbye and climbed into the passenger seat of what appeared to be a perfectly normal civilian car driven by what appeared to be a perfectly normal civilian driver. What Madison's network of informants wouldn't realize was that the driver was Staff Sergeant Patricia Williams, a military police investigator who specialized in cases involving civilian-military cooperation. "You ready for this, kiddo?" Sergeant Williams asked as they drove toward the wealthy neighborhood where Madison lived. "As ready as I can be," Sarah replied. "Are you clear on the mission parameters?" "Crystal clear. I maintain visual surveillance from a distance, monitor your communications, and intervene only if you signal for extraction or if I observe evidence of immediate physical danger. If things go according to plan, I document everything for potential federal investigation." Sarah nodded, feeling the familiar calm that came with knowing she had competent backup. Madison's house was exactly what Sarah had expected: a massive colonial mansion set back from the street behind perfectly manicured lawns and expensive landscaping. Cars were already parked along the circular driveway and spilling out onto the street, most of them the kind of expensive vehicles that reflected the wealth of Riverside's elite families. Sarah could hear music and voices coming from the backyard, where the party was apparently centered around a swimming pool and outdoor entertainment area that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. She walked up to the front door and rang the bell, noting the security cameras and expensive lighting that suggested the Walsh family took their privacy and protection seriously. Madison answered the door herself, wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than Sarah's entire wardrobe. Her smile was perfect and completely fake. "Sarah, I wasn't sure you'd actually come," Madison said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "I'm so glad you decided to join us." "Thanks for inviting me," Sarah replied with equal false sincerity. Madison led her through the house, which was decorated with the kind of aggressive luxury that was meant to intimidate visitors into remembering their place in the social hierarchy. They passed a living room where several adults were having drinks and conversation, including people Sarah recognized from her research as Madison's parents and other members of the local power structure. "Mom, Dad, this is the new girl I was telling you about," Madison announced as they passed the adult gathering. Robert Walsh was a large man with the kind of confident presence that came from never having been seriously challenged. Patricia Walsh was perfectly put together in the way that required significant time and money to maintain. "Welcome to Riverside, dear," Mrs. Walsh said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I hope you're adjusting well to our little community." "Everyone's been very helpful," Sarah replied diplomatically. "I'm sure they have," Mr. Walsh added. "Military families sometimes have trouble understanding how civilian communities work, but I'm sure you'll figure it out." The condescension was obvious and intentional. Sarah filed it away as evidence of the attitude that enabled Madison's behavior. Madison continued the tour to the backyard, where the party was in full swing. There were about 50 teenagers present, most of whom Sarah recognized from school. The pool area was lit with expensive lighting, and a professional DJ was providing music from a setup that looked like it belonged at a commercial venue rather than a house party. What immediately caught Sarah's attention, however, was the presence of alcohol. Not just the beer that might be expected at a high school party, but top-shelf liquor and cocktails being served by what appeared to be hired bartenders who were clearly not checking anyone's identification. This was a clear violation of multiple laws, being conducted with apparent impunity in front of adults who were obviously aware of what was happening. Sarah activated her recording device and began documenting what she observed, moving through the party with the practiced eye of someone trained in surveillance and intelligence gathering. Within the first hour, she observed and recorded evidence of underage drinking being provided by adults, what appeared to be illegal drug use in the pool house, and several instances of aggressive behavior that crossed the line into assault, all while the hired security personnel looked the other way.
Having a good time?
Trevor appeared beside her with the kind of predatory grin that suggested he had been drinking for a while.
It's quite a party, Sarah replied neutrally.
Yeah, Madison's family really knows how to do things right, Trevor said, moving closer than was comfortable.
Not like those cheap military parties on base, right? Sarah stepped back, maintaining her distance. I wouldn't know. I don't attend base parties.
Right, because you're just a kid, Trevor said with a laugh. But, tonight, you're going to learn how real adults party. Before Sarah could respond, Madison appeared with Jessica and Brittany, all three of them carrying drinks and wearing expressions of anticipatory malice.
Sarah!
There you are, Madison said with false enthusiasm.
We've been looking for you. It's time for your initiation.
My what? Sarah asked, though she had a pretty good idea where this was headed. Well, you can't just come to our party and expect to fit in without proving you belong here, Madison explained.
Everyone has to go through initiation.
What kind of initiation?
Sarah asked. Madison's smile became openly cruel. It's simple.
You just have to do a few things to show that you understand how things work around here. She gestured toward a table that had been set up near the pool, where several bottles of expensive liquor were arranged alongside what appeared to be a series of increasingly humiliating challenges.
First, you drink everything on this tray, Madison announced loudly enough to draw the attention of nearby party guests.
Then, you tell everyone here why military families are parasites who live off the hard work of real Americans. Then, you get in the pool fully clothed and swim a lap while everyone records it for social media. Sarah looked at the setup and realized this was exactly the kind of coordinated humiliation that Madison had planned. The forced drinking would be illegal and potentially dangerous. The recorded statements would be used to damage Sarah's reputation and potentially her father's career.
And the social media documentation would ensure the humiliation followed her for years.
More importantly, Sarah realized that this was probably Madison's standard method of controlling new students. Create a situation where the victim either submitted to public humiliation or refused and faced retaliation.
That's quite a list, Sarah said calmly.
It's really not that bad, Madison said with false sympathy.
Everyone here has done it.
It's just our way of making sure you're committed to being part of our community. Sarah looked around at the faces watching her, noting the mixture of excitement, sympathy, and anticipation. These teenagers had all either participated in this kind of abuse or watched it happen to others without intervening.
And if I refuse? Sarah asked. Madison's mask slipped slightly, revealing the cold calculation underneath.
Then, I guess you'll find out how difficult life can be for families who don't understand their place in our community. The threat was clear and public.
Madison was using her family's influence to coerce Sarah into submitting to illegal and humiliating treatment, in front of witnesses who would either participate or remain silent due to their own fear of retaliation.
In military terms, this was exactly the kind of abuse of power that federal authorities were designed to investigate and prosecute. Sarah made her decision. I understand, she said, stepping toward the table. But, before I do this, I have a question.
What? Madison asked, clearly expecting victory.
Do you really think, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet party area, that the daughter of United States Army General Marcus Chen is going to be intimidated by a small-town wannabe dictator who thinks daddy's money makes her untouchable?
The silence that followed was complete. Madison's expression shifted from confident malice to confused shock as Sarah's words registered.
That's right, Sarah continued, her voice taking on the command presence she had learned from her father.
My dad isn't just any soldier.
He's a general who specializes in investigating corruption and abuse of power. And everything that's happened here tonight has been recorded and will be forwarded to the appropriate federal authorities for investigation. She pulled out her phone and held it up, showing that it had been recording.
Did you really think I'd come here without backup? Without documentation? Without a plan? Madison's face had gone pale. You're lying. Am I? Sarah asked. Why don't you ask the professional surveillance team that's been monitoring this party from the beginning? Or the federal agents who are currently reviewing your family's government contracts for irregularities? Or the IRS investigators who are very interested in how your family affords this lifestyle on your official reported income?
None of this was actually happening yet, but Sarah knew that Madison's guilty conscience would make her assume the worst.
You can't do this, Madison stammered. My family has rights. We have connections.
Your family has been abusing their power to terrorize teenagers and their families, Sarah replied coldly.
That stops now.
She turned to address the crowd of stunned party guests.
Anyone who wants to avoid being included in the federal investigation of this situation should probably leave now. Anyone who wants to provide evidence of the abuse they've witnessed or experienced should contact the base military police. Your choice. The response was immediate. Students began leaving the party in groups, many of them pulling out phones to call for rides. Within 10 minutes, the crowd had shrunk to just Madison's inner circle and a few hangers-on who seemed too shocked to move. Madison tried to recover her composure. This is still my house, and you're trespassing. Actually, Sarah replied, I was invited.
And I'm not finished documenting what I've observed here tonight. She began walking around the party area, openly recording the evidence of illegal activity that Madison's family had allowed to occur on their property.
Stop that, Trevor demanded, grabbing for Sarah's phone.
Sarah stepped back smoothly, avoiding his reach with the kind of trained movement that suggested serious martial arts training. I wouldn't recommend trying that again, she said quietly. Something in her tone made Trevor hesitate. For the first time, he seemed to realize that Sarah wasn't the helpless victim they had planned to humiliate. Madison's mother appeared from the house, having apparently noticed the sudden exodus of party guests.
What's going on out here? Mrs. Walsh demanded.
Your daughter just discovered that some people fight back when threatened, Sarah replied calmly. Mrs. Walsh looked at the recording device in Sarah's hand, and her expression shifted from annoyance to genuine concern. I think perhaps this party has gone on long enough, she said carefully.
I agree, Sarah replied. I've documented everything I need for my report.
She turned back to Madison, who was still standing by the humiliation table like a queen whose kingdom had just crumbled around her.
You made one crucial mistake, Madison, Sarah said. You assumed that because I was new and outnumbered, I was helpless. But you never bothered to find out who you were really dealing with.
Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Sergeant Williams, extraction ready when you are.
Time for me to go, Sarah announced. Thank you for the educational evening. I'm sure we'll all learn a lot from this experience.
As she walked through the house toward the front door, Sarah felt the satisfaction that came with a successful mission. She had gathered the evidence needed to build a case against Madison's network of abuse, documented their methods and power structure, and demonstrated that their reign of terror was not as invincible as they believed. But, more importantly, she had sent a message that would spread through Riverside High School and the broader community. Some people couldn't be intimidated, no matter how much power and influence their opponents thought they had. The real battle was just beginning, but Sarah Chen had won the first engagement. And now Madison Walsh would learn what it felt like to face an opponent who fought with strategy, preparation, and the backing of genuine authority. Monday morning arrived with the kind of electric tension that preceded major confrontations. Sarah walked through the halls of Riverside High School aware that everyone was watching her, waiting to see what consequences would follow from Saturday night's events. The whispered conversations that followed in her wake suggested that word of what had happened at Madison's party had spread through the entire school over the weekend. But Sarah noticed something different in the way students looked at her now. Instead of the mixture of pity and morbid curiosity she had seen before, there was something that looked suspiciously like respect. And, more importantly, several students who had previously avoided eye contact were now nodding or offering tentative smiles as she passed. David was waiting for her at her locker, looking both anxious and impressed. "Is it true?" he asked quietly as she opened her combination lock. "Is what true?" Sarah replied, though she had a good idea what he meant. "That your dad is really a general? That you recorded everything at Madison's party? That there's going to be some kind of federal investigation?" Sarah considered her response carefully. "My father's rank isn't a secret, and I did document some concerning behavior that night. As for investigations, that depends on what the appropriate authorities decide to do with the information they receive." David's eyes widened. "So it's really happening. Someone's actually going to hold them accountable." "That remains to be seen," Sarah said diplomatically. "But abuse of power doesn't go unnoticed forever." As they walked toward first period, Sarah noticed that Madison was nowhere to be seen. Neither were Trevor, Jessica, or most of Madison's usual entourage. The absence of the school's power structure created a strange vacuum that other students seemed unsure how to navigate. In American history class, Mrs. Rodriguez made an announcement that confirmed Sarah's suspicions about what was happening behind the scenes. "Students, I want to remind everyone that this school has zero tolerance for harassment, intimidation, or abuse of any kind. If anyone has experienced or witnessed behavior that makes them feel unsafe, please report it to the administration immediately. All reports will be taken seriously and investigated thoroughly." The announcement was clearly prompted by recent events, and Sarah noticed several students exchanging meaningful looks. During lunch, something unprecedented happened. Instead of eating alone or with just David, Sarah found herself approached by a steady stream of students who had never spoken to her before. They came individually or in small groups, as if they were afraid to be seen talking to her in large numbers. "Hey, Sarah?" A girl named Maria from her English class sat down hesitantly across from her. "I just wanted to say, thanks." "For what?" Sarah asked. "For what you did Saturday night. Madison and her crew have been making my life hell since freshman year because my family doesn't have money. They made me feel like I was worthless, like I didn't belong here. But, seeing someone finally stand up to them." Maria's voice trailed off, but her expression said everything. Similar conversations continued throughout the lunch period. A boy named Carlos talked about how Trevor had been forcing him to do homework for the football team under threat of physical violence. A girl named Ashley described being excluded and humiliated by Madison's group for 2 years because she wouldn't participate in their campaigns against other students. Sarah realized that she had stumbled into something much larger than a simple bullying situation. Madison's network hadn't just been targeting new students or isolated individuals, they had been systematically terrorizing anyone who didn't fit their definition of acceptable social status. "Why didn't anyone report this before?" Sarah asked during one conversation. "To who?" replied Jake, a sophomore who described being forced to give Madison's friends answers during tests. "Mr. Patterson is scared of the school board, which Madison's mom runs. The teachers know which families donate to their programs. And the police chief is Jessica's dad. Who were we supposed to tell?" The scope of the problem was becoming clearer. This wasn't just teenage bullying, it was a systematic abuse of power that had corrupted multiple levels of the local community structure. Tuesday brought new developments. Madison returned to school, but she looked different. Gone was the confident swagger and casual cruelty that had defined her behavior. She moved through the halls with the cautious demeanor of someone who was no longer sure of her position or safety. Sarah observed that Madison's former followers were maintaining careful distance from her. Trevor was notably absent, and Jessica seemed to be actively avoiding her former best friend. The social structure that had seemed so solid and intimidating was crumbling with remarkable speed. During chemistry class, David slipped Sarah another note. "My mom says there are FBI agents asking questions at City Hall. Something about federal contract irregularities and civil rights violations. Your dad doesn't mess around." Sarah felt a mix of satisfaction and concern. She had wanted Madison to face consequences for her behavior, but she was also aware that once federal authorities became involved, the situation would spiral far beyond anything she could control.
That afternoon, Sarah was called to the principal's office.
She found Mr. Patterson waiting for her along with two adults she didn't recognize, a woman in a conservative business suit and a man who carried himself with military bearing despite wearing civilian clothes.
"Miss Chen," Mr. Patterson said, his voice carefully neutral, "these are Special Agents Morrison and Bradley from the FBI. They'd like to ask you a few questions."
Sarah sat down in the chair they indicated, drawing on years of watching her father interact with federal investigators during various military operations. "Miss Chen," Agent Morrison began, "we understand you recently attended a party where you may have witnessed certain activities that concern federal law enforcement."
"Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied.
"I documented what I observed and provided the documentation to my father for review and appropriate action."
"Can you describe what you witnessed?" Agent Bradley asked.
Sarah provided a clear, factual account of Saturday night's events, including the systematic intimidation, the provision of alcohol to minors by adults, and the evidence of ongoing abuse of power by connected families. She spoke with the precision and attention to detail that came from years of listening to military briefings. "We're particularly interested in any evidence of coordination between local officials and private citizens to suppress reports of misconduct," Agent Morrison said. Sarah described the conversation she had overheard about police protection for the party, the pattern of economic retaliation against families who challenged the Walsh network, and the systematic suppression of student complaints through intimidation. "This is very helpful," Agent Bradley said when she finished. "We may need to speak with you again as our investigation proceeds." "Of course," Sarah replied. "My father and I are prepared to cooperate fully with any federal investigation." As Sarah left the principal's office, she noticed that Mr. Patterson looked like a man who was beginning to understand that his careful balancing act between local politics and educational responsibility was about to be thoroughly examined by people who couldn't be intimidated or bought off.
Wednesday brought the most dramatic development yet.
Madison didn't come to school at all, and rumors were spreading that her family had left town suddenly. Jessica was present but looked like she had been crying, and the few remaining members of Madison's former circle seemed to be trying desperately to distance themselves from their previous behavior. During lunch, David updated Sarah on what his mother had learned at the courthouse. "It's bigger than anyone thought," he whispered urgently.
"The FBI isn't just looking at the bullying stuff.
They're investigating the whole network.
Government contracts, tax evasion, civil rights violations, abuse of office."
"Your recording from Saturday night was just the beginning."
"What do you mean?" Sarah asked.
"Your dad apparently provided the FBI with a complete analysis of the power structure here, including financial records and communication patterns that suggest organized corruption. They're treating this like a RICO case." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine.
RICO was the federal racketeering statute used to prosecute organized crime.
If the FBI was applying that framework to the Walsh network, it meant they believed there was evidence of ongoing criminal enterprise, not just isolated incidents of abuse. "There's more," David continued. "My mom heard that several other families from nearby towns have come forward with similar stories. Apparently, this network extends beyond just Riverside. They've been operating in multiple school districts, using the same tactics to control local politics and business opportunities."
The implications were staggering.
What Sarah had thought was a local problem with teenage bullying had apparently exposed a multi-jurisdictional corruption scheme that had been operating for years.
Thursday morning brought a formal announcement that changed everything.
Mr. Patterson called a special assembly where he introduced Dr. Elizabeth Carter, a federal education oversight specialist who would be conducting a comprehensive review of the school's policies and procedures. Dr. Carter was a formidable woman with the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention and respect. She addressed the student body with the directness that Sarah recognized from military leadership. "Students, recent events have brought to light serious concerns about the culture and leadership of this institution. I want you to understand that harassment, intimidation, and abuse will not be tolerated under federal education standards, regardless of the social or economic status of the perpetrators." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. Over the next several weeks, my team will be conducting interviews with students, faculty, and staff to ensure that this school provides a safe and equitable learning environment for all students. Anyone who has experienced or witnessed misconduct is encouraged to come forward without fear of retaliation. The message was clear: the federal government was taking control of the situation, and the local power structure that had protected abusers would no longer be effective. After the assembly, Sarah was approached by more students than ever before. But these weren't just victims seeking to share their stories, they were students who wanted to thank her for creating an environment where they could finally speak up without fear.
"You probably don't remember me," said a senior named Michael who Sarah recognized from seeing around school.
"But I was at Madison's party Saturday night. I saw what you did, and I wanted you to know that you gave a lot of us the courage to finally tell the truth about what's been happening here."
Sarah felt a mix of pride and humility.
She had set out to protect herself and gather evidence of misconduct, but apparently her actions had inspired a much broader movement toward accountability and justice.
Friday brought the most satisfying development of all.
Word spread through the school that Trevor had been arrested on charges including assault, providing alcohol to minors, and conspiracy to violate civil rights.
Jessica's father had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation.
And the Walsh family's business empire was facing federal scrutiny that would likely result in multiple prosecutions. But, more importantly, the culture of the school was already beginning to change. Students who had been terrorized into silence were speaking up about their experiences. Teachers who had looked the other way were now actively monitoring for signs of abuse. And the administration was implementing new policies to ensure that complaints would be taken seriously regardless of the social status of those involved. During her final class of the week, Sarah received a text from her father: "Mission accomplished.
Proud of how you handled yourself.
Real change takes courage, and you showed plenty of both." As Sarah walked out of Riverside High School that Friday afternoon, she reflected on how much had changed in just 1 week. She had arrived as the new girl trying to avoid conflict, but she was ending the week as someone who had helped expose and dismantle a network of corruption that had been harming students for years. But, perhaps most importantly, she had learned that sometimes the best way to avoid a fight is to be prepared to win one. Madison Walsh had tried to bully someone she thought was weak and isolated, only to discover that she had chosen to target the daughter of a general who had been trained to recognize and respond to exactly this kind of abuse of power. The war for Riverside High School wasn't over yet, but Sarah Chen had won the most important battle, proving that no one was too powerful to be held accountable when they abused their authority to harm others. 3 weeks after the party that changed everything, Riverside High School felt like a completely different place. Sarah walked through hallways that buzzed with a new kind of energy, one based on mutual respect rather than fear.
The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but the changes were profound and seemingly permanent.
The most visible change was in how students interacted with each other. Conversations that had once been conducted in fearful whispers were now happening openly. Students who had been invisible for years were participating in class discussions, joining clubs, and forming friendships across social lines that had previously been rigidly enforced. Sarah had become something she never expected to be, a hero to her fellow students. But it wasn't the kind of hero worship that made her uncomfortable. Instead, it was the quiet respect that came from people recognizing that she had risked her own safety to protect others. "Sarah, wait up," called Maria, jogging to catch up with her between classes. Over the past weeks, Maria had transformed from a terrified, isolated girl into someone who was actively involved in student government and advocating for policy changes.
"What's up?" Sarah asked, adjusting her backpack. "I wanted to let you know that the new anti-bullying committee had its first meeting yesterday. We've got representatives from every grade level, and Dr. Carter is helping us develop protocols that will actually protect students instead of just protecting the school's reputation." Sarah smiled at the enthusiasm in Maria's voice. "That's great. How many students are participating?" "Over 40 so far, and more are joining every week." It turns out that once people feel safe to speak up, they have a lot to say about making this place better. The anti-bullying committee was just one of many changes that had emerged from the federal investigation.
Dr. Carter had implemented a complete restructuring of the school's reporting and response systems, creating multiple channels for students to report problems without fear of retaliation. More importantly, the investigation had revealed that the problems at Riverside High School were part of a much larger pattern of corruption that extended throughout the region. Federal prosecutors had uncovered evidence of bid rigging, tax evasion, civil rights violations, and systematic abuse of power that involved dozens of officials and business leaders across multiple counties. The Walsh family had fled to avoid prosecution, but their assets had been frozen and their business empire was being dismantled by federal authorities. Robert Walsh was facing charges that could result in decades in prison, while Patricia Walsh's position on the school board had been terminated and she was cooperating with investigators in exchange for reduced charges. Trevor was in juvenile detention awaiting trial on assault and conspiracy charges. His football scholarship had been revoked, and his family's car dealership was under investigation for overcharging government contracts. Jessica's father had been indicted on corruption charges and was no longer police chief, while Jessica herself had transferred to a private school in another state. But perhaps the most significant change was in the student body itself. With the culture of fear and intimidation removed, Riverside High School was discovering what it could become when students felt safe to be themselves and pursue their interests without worrying about social retaliation. David had emerged as a natural leader, using his intelligence and quiet integrity to help bridge different social groups. He was working with the new administration to create academic programs that would give all students access to advanced coursework, not just those from wealthy families. "You know," David said as he joined Sarah and Maria for lunch, "I never imagined this place could feel like an actual school instead of a prison." "It's amazing what happens when people aren't afraid to be decent to each other," Sarah replied. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Carlos, Ashley, Jake, and several other students who had formed what was becoming known as the Saturday Night Club, students who had either witnessed or learned about the events at Madison's party and were committed to making sure nothing like it happened again. "Hey Sarah," Carlos said as he sat down, "I wanted to update you on the scholarship fund." One of the unexpected developments from the investigation was the discovery that the Walsh Network had been systematically denying scholarship opportunities to deserving students based on their family's political and social compliance. Dr. Carter was working with federal education officials to create a new scholarship program that would be awarded based purely on merit and need. "We've identified 12 students from this year alone who should have received scholarships but were rejected because their families weren't politically connected," Carlos continued. "The federal government is providing funding to make sure they can attend college next year." Sarah felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the cafeteria's heating system. These students weren't just getting justice for past wrongs, they were building a foundation for a better future. "There's something else," Ashley added, looking slightly nervous. "The FBI agents want to talk to you again. Something about testifying before a federal grand jury." Sarah nodded. She had been expecting this development. As the investigation had expanded, her role as the catalyst who exposed the corruption had become increasingly important to the prosecution's case. That afternoon, Sarah met with Agent Morrison and Agent Bradley in a conference room at the federal building downtown. Her father accompanied her, both as a parent and as a professional consultant to the investigation. "Miss Chen," Agent Morrison began, "thanks to your courage in documenting and reporting the activities you witnessed, we've been able to build a comprehensive case against a criminal organization that has been operating for over a decade. The grand jury is considering charges against 37 individuals across 4 counties," Agent Bradley added. "Your testimony will be crucial in helping them understand how this network operated and why federal intervention was necessary." Sarah looked at her father, who nodded encouragingly. "I'm prepared to testify," Sarah said. "What do I need to know about the process?" The agents spent the next hour briefing Sarah on grand jury procedures and the scope of the charges being considered. The case had grown far beyond what any of them had initially imagined, encompassing everything from civil rights violations to organized crime statutes. "There's one more thing," Agent Morrison said as the meeting concluded. "The Attorney General's office wants to recognize your actions with a Civilian Service Award. Your willingness to stand up against corruption, despite personal risk, exemplifies the kind of civic courage that makes democracy work." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had grown from her decision to document and report Madison's abuse. "I just did what I thought was right," she said. "That's exactly the point," her father replied. "Doing what's right when it's difficult is what makes the difference between a functioning society and a corrupt one." As they drove back to the base, Sarah's father offered some perspective that helped her process everything that had happened. "You know, Sarah, in my 30 years of military service, I've learned that the most important battles aren't always fought on battlefields. Sometimes they're fought in school cafeterias and, at teenage parties, by young people who refuse to accept that abuse of power is inevitable." "Do you think it will stick?" Sarah asked. "The changes, I mean. What happens when Dr. Carter leaves and the federal oversight ends?" General Chen considered the question carefully. "That depends on whether the students and families of Riverside have learned something about their own power. You showed them that ordinary people can hold corrupt officials accountable, but they have to choose to keep using that power." 3 months later, Sarah received news that answered her question definitively. The spring student body elections at Riverside High School had produced the most diverse and engaged student government in the school's history. Maria had been elected student body president on a platform of continued reform and transparency. David was heading the academic council, working to expand educational opportunities for all students. Carlos had been elected to the disciplinary review board, ensuring student voices in addressing behavioral issues. Most significantly, voter turnout had been over 90%, nearly triple the historical average. Students who had never participated in school governance were now actively engaged in shaping their educational environment. The changes extended beyond the school as well. The corruption investigation had prompted a broader civic awakening in Riverside and surrounding communities. Local elections that had previously been uncontested were now featuring multiple candidates, and citizen oversight committees were being established to monitor government spending and policy decisions. Sarah's role in triggering these changes had made her something of a local legend, but she was more interested in the long-term implications of what had happened. "You realize," David said during one of their regular lunch conversations, "that you've basically created a generation of students who will never accept corruption as normal. We're all going to college and careers knowing that abuse of power can be challenged and defeated." "That's the real victory," Sarah replied. "Not just stopping Madison and her network, but showing everyone that they don't have to accept being treated badly by people with power." As her senior year drew to a close, Sarah reflected on the unexpected path her life had taken since arriving in Riverside. She had come to the town as the daughter of a military family, expecting to spend a quiet year finishing high school before moving on to her next duty station. Instead, she had become part of something much larger, a community transformation that demonstrated the power of individual courage to create systemic change. The culmination came at graduation, where Sarah was invited to speak as the class valedictorian not because she had the highest grades, though her academic performance was excellent, but because her classmates had voted her the person who best represented the values they wanted to carry forward. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience that included her proud parents, federal officials who had become colleagues in the fight for justice, and hundreds of students and families whose lives had been changed by recent events, Sarah chose her words carefully. "A wise person once told me that the most important battles aren't always fought on traditional battlefields," she began. "Sometimes they're fought by ordinary people in everyday situations, when they choose to stand up for what's right instead of accepting what's wrong." She paused, seeing nods of understanding throughout the audience. 3 months ago, this school and this community were controlled by a system that valued wealth and connections over character and justice. Students were afraid to speak up, families were afraid to challenge authority, and good people remained silent because they thought they were powerless. But we learned something important: we were never powerless. We just needed someone to remind us that our voices mattered and our actions could make a difference. Sarah looked directly at Maria, David, Carlos, and the dozens of other students who had found their courage over the past months. "The changes we've made here aren't just about stopping bullies or punishing corrupt officials. They're about proving that democracy works when ordinary people choose to participate in it actively and courageously. As we leave this school and enter the larger world, I hope we remember that lesson. There will always be people who abuse power, who try to silence opposition, who believe that money and connections make them untouchable. But there will also always be opportunities for good people to stand up, speak out, and create positive change.
The question isn't whether we have the power to make a difference. The question is whether we have the courage to use it.
Sarah concluded her speech to sustained applause, but the moment that meant the most to her came afterward, when a group of incoming freshmen approached her with a question that showed how completely the school culture had changed.
"Miss Chen," one of them said nervously, "we heard about what you did when you were new here. We wanted to know if you think we're ready to keep making things better, even after you graduate."
Sarah smiled at the eager, determined faces looking up at her. "I think," she said, "that you're more ready than any freshman class in this school's history. You're starting high school in a place where your voice matters, where standing up for what's right is celebrated instead of punished, and where you have proof that change is possible. Just remember," she added, "that freedom and justice aren't things that get established once and then maintained automatically.
Every generation has to choose to protect and expand them. That's your job now."
As Sarah walked across the graduation stage to receive her diploma, she felt the satisfaction that came from a mission completed successfully. But, more than that, she felt excitement about the future, both her own and that of the community she was leaving behind. She had arrived in Riverside as the new girl trying to avoid trouble. She was leaving as a young woman who had learned that sometimes the best way to avoid trouble is to confront it head-on, with courage, preparation, and the support of people who share your commitment to justice. The bullies who had tried to intimidate her had been defeated, but their defeat was less important than what had risen to replace their reign of terror: a community of engaged, empowered young people who would carry the lessons of Riverside High School into whatever future they chose to build.
Madison Walsh had thought she was dealing with just another vulnerable new student.
Instead, she had encountered the daughter of General Marcus Chen, trained in military values and strategic thinking, prepared to fight for what was right and equipped with the tools to win. The war for Riverside High School was over, and justice had prevailed. But the real victory was the army of young leaders who would continue the fight for fairness and integrity wherever their paths might lead them.
Sarah Chen had been the new girl who wouldn't be bullied.
Now she was the graduate who had taught an entire community that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept corruption as inevitable. The future was bright with possibility, and it belonged to those brave enough to claim it.